The coffee landed like a thrown brand. It struck flesh, a burst of heat and sound. Shayla's cry cut clean through the hum of the downtown cafe. Steam rose in a sharp, white mouth where her blouse clung to skin. People recoiled. Phones lifted. Laughter answered her, screamed the rich kind, brittle and casual, coming from Alexander Wang as he recorded, thumb scrolling with the practiced ease of someone unused to consequences. For a long, suspended second, the room did nothing. Fingers hovered over screens, cameras zoomed, napkins were stuffed into mouths. The barista froze with a pitcher still warm in his hand. The cafe's glass facade reflected a dozen shocked faces. Someone muttered, "Call an ambulance," and then thought better of it. In the corner booth, behind a stack of paperwork and a black coffee gone cold, Jin Woo sat very still. He had watched the city change in the years since he arrived here, seen how money could rewrite a scene faster than a camera could capture it. Tonight, he watched a man perform his cruelty and brand it as entertainment. He stood, the motion quiet, and moved through the stunned auditorium of patrons like someone threading a needle. Not to challenge the man who had poured scalding liquid on a stranger, but to insist on what everyone else would not. "Someone get her ice and call an ambulance now," Jean said, voice low but carrying across the tables. He crouched at Shayla's side, peeled back sodden fabric, hissed when he saw the angry redness blooming along her arm and the skin already blistering. He took her hand with a care people often reserve for the fragile things that have already been broken. Alexander kept filming, angling for the best shot. He laughed, small and hard, when the feed showed his face. "Come on, Shay," he said, as if to a dog, as if everything in the room were a joke, and the joke required only a human punchline. He smirked at his friends, at his security detail, who stood like trophies behind him. A waitress had been reduced to content in a single gesture. His world had widened by the applauding pixels. It was only after Jean called for help with an authority that smelled neither of money nor fear that someone finally moved. The barista rediscovered his voice. Someone took Shayla's other hand. A woman held a napkin to Shayla's mouth while somebody else pressed on a phone screen with shaking fingers. Alexander's laughter faded when the paramedics arrived and cameras in their pockets became tools, not applause. At the hospital, antiseptic and fluorescent light painted everything too bright. Shayla lay on a narrow bed with her arm dressed in cool gel wraps, the pain in her face honest and combustible. The doctor spoke in clipped syllables about burns and infection and temporary disability. The words hovered, legal and categorical, but they did not speak to Rentu next week, to the calls from home, to the arrangement she had with her sister, to the promises she had made to the people depending on her. "How did you pay for your visit?" Jean asked quietly, refusing to sit on the plastic chair. He'd taken a taxi after the cafe, Phantom's black Jinder resting against his leg like a heavy, watchful shadow. The dog had been as much a presence as Jean's quiet when they moved through the city, a sentinel with dark eyes and a soldier's restraint. Shayla laughed once, a brittle sound. "I had 2 shifts lined up. I can try to make up the rest." She swallowed around the pain and the indignity. "I can't lose work. My sister Kashashi's been missing since last month. She filed something," said Wang Industries said. "She saw people being kept at a warehouse. She told me she started a complaint, and then she vanished. I ran to the precinct. They gave me a number and said they'd call me." "They didn't." Shayla's voice thinned. There were details she kept to the edges, names she refused to say out loud at first, for fear they'd vanish into air. The way Keisha had bought everything in her mouth tasted of the same small, chronic desperation that came from holding a family on a threadbare paycheck. She'd moved to the city, hoping to build something for Keisha and their mother. Instead, she was a ledger, human, and easy to write off. Jean listened with the hunger of someone who catalogued the world not by headlines but by the fine mabloid details of people's brokenness. For years he'd been an enigma to the city's tabloids, an immigrant who turned up where something ugly had happened, then never left. He had been called other things, softer things in quieter circles, protector, fixer, someone who put his name where it hurt to make people look. He thought of the slow escalation of entitlement. He thought of the way Alexander's laugh had filled the cafe like a smear of grease that would be hard to clean. He thought of Kesha missing because someone else had the power to erase a person. He watched Shayla press gauze to skin and let her live in the same cramped timeline that the rest of the city had. Clock in, endure, hope to sleep. Did Kesha leave any message? A place she might go? Jean asked. She sent me a picture once, Shayla said. A phone she said was at a factory. She called me from a payphone, said to trust her. That was the last time. Jean put his hand over hers. You did everything right, he said, meaning it in the way the city seldom meant things. A rare, stabilizing truth. You told people. You kept the evidence you had. You didn't let them tell you it was your fault. Shayla's eyes flared with something like both gratitude and hunger. On Animal leaned to the scent of help. I can't do this alone, she whispered. They won't be the only ones who know now, Jean said. In the corner of the hospital's waiting room, Alexander's name still had the sheen of privilege behind it. Everyone knew the family. The Wongs were a dynasty of towers and donations, of quiet political favors that saw statutes bent and witness accounts purchased. Victor Wong had built a company that supplied muscles to the city's growth, factories, logistics, recruitment networks across borders. The public met the family on corporate billboards and in museum wings. They met them in gala photographs and scholarship plaques. They did not see the factory floor or the rooms between spreadsheets and forklifts. Alexander himself had been more than a footnote in the newspaper's gossip columns. He had a history of social incidentals, rumors and quiet settlements, charges that disappeared into envelopes and silence. Each time it had been explained away as the misstep of a wayward son, the cost of growing pains in the elite. The money smoothed the world into Tonight, he had smoothed it into a video. Jean's background, when people did speculate, sounded like a montage, some heroic, some murky. He had arrived as a child with his parents, pockets empty but limbs strong. He'd learned the city's edges, where charity stopped and survival began. For a time he had been a soldier in an unnamed conflict, enough training to move without being seen, enough lost to prefer to let the city do the talking. He'd spent the years that followed building a network. Former veterans who had nowhere else to go. Minds burned out by the official systems that chewed people and spat them into the storm drains. Women whose backs were used to hauling boxers and not to the bright lights of confession. Small-time crooks who owed more to a moral code than to the law. It was not a network of heroes in the cleaning the streets sense. It was a group of people who had been pushed out of the light and had decided to not let others go unlooked for. Fenta touched his foot, a slow pulse of black fur, and Jean felt the city's pulse through the dog, as if phantom beats could confirm a plan. He had watched the wealthy do their worst for years and learned how to make them fight over the things they thought were untouchable: reputation, stock value, control. He had also learned the value of witnesses, of little documents and receipts that wouldn't seem to matter until they did. But he wasn't a lawman. He knew the line between making the law work and dragging it by its heels. He thought of Shayla's missing sister as an account left unresolved, a debt that had to be called. Sometimes the city required a nudge in the right direction. Sometimes, he thought, it required a shove. Word travels differently in places where people have no inkling of the difference between a headline and a body count. Jean used that speed like a lens, not to make spectacle, but to make truth visible. He left Shayla with a number and a promise that sounded both terrifying and kind. Don't say anything to the press. Let us gather what we need. You have done enough already. She stared at him, a question spread across her mouth. Who are you to tell me to wait? I'm someone who knows what happens when people rush, he said. He did not offer an identity beyond that. He had a way of making people transfer their trust to something bigger than his name, a patience that had been earned through results, a stoicism that did not flinch when the powerful got loud. The city took a breath, and then plunged into whatever its next act was going to be. Word of the assault spread across feeds by morning. A short video of a rich kid pouring hot coffee onto a woman and laughing. The clip had 1 million views before midday. Comment sections filled with reflexive outrage and performative apologies. Hot takes multiplied faster than any redress. Jean watched the feeds for a while, not with the thirsty detachment of a man who enjoyed chaos, but as a cartographer of consequence. He reached out to people who owed him favors, those who could be trusted to keep their mouths shut while they opened the right doors. He parceled things into time windows and stepped into the space where law and truth orbited. He did not equate money with power. Money was a tool, often effective in the short term. Power, to him, was the ability to keep someone alive long enough for the truth to find its way to paper. He called an old contact, Arturo Prado, a small-time union organizer, who ran a cramped office behind abandoned store. Arturo answered without preamble. "You saw it?" he asked. "I saw it," Jean said. "I need you to listen to a woman who knows where to look." Arturo's voice softened. "She's a waitress. There's no smoke without fire. Bring me what you have. Names, places, dates. If we can stitch a pattern, we can make them pay attention." Jean knew where attention could be turned into pressure. He knew a woman who used attention as a tool instead of a mirror. Melissa Chun had spent the last decade of her life turning up to the corners of stories that the city would rather skim. She had started at local papers and moved to an outlet that prided itself on long-read investigations and an uncompromising appetite for documents that smelled of bureaucracy and money. She had a presence that made boardrooms feel like interrogation rooms. She wrote with a clarity that exposed malice without theatrics. Her pieces had toppled executives before. They'd forced quiet settlements into public squares. People who had thought money could buy sleep had woken in the middle of the night to find a news story on their doorstep. Jean and Melissa's first meeting was in a parked car behind a laundromat at midnight. No cinematic lights, only the fluorescent hum from the laundromat's windows. Jean slid a thumb drive across the dashboard like an offering. Melissa turned it in the light, regarded him with the scrutiny of someone who had seen too many desperate men come with too many urgent claims. "You're not the first to bring me a drive," she said. "It's either evidence or a trap." Jean nodded. "It's both," he said, "and I understand the difference." She asked questions without preface. Who else knew? What corroboration existed? Did he have names? He answered with names. A manager who had once been a whistleblower and never been heard from again. A driver who had kept receipts showing odd shipments on nights that didn't line up with inventory. A security guard who had the decency to keep his mouth, but the weakness to keep a tape. Jean would not, and would not be asked to, break the law for her. He would, however, bring forward people who might risk the law for truth. Melissa stared at the tiny plastic rectangle between her fingers, as though it might contain the city itself. She asked him to give her 48 hours to run it through the newsroom's verification protocol. "If it holds up, we'll run. And it won't be a morning splash. It'll be a drop in their ledger. It'll force questions they can't buy their way out of." "People are already buying their way out of it," Jean said. "They'll try." "Then we'll make it expensive," Melissa replied. "Not for me. For them." They sketched the anatomy of an expose with the caution of people who had learned the cost of being wrong. They discussed safe houses in abstract places where witnesses could sleep without the worry of someone's truck idling outside, and protocols that smelled of insurance and quiet phone numbers. Jean avoided details that sounded like manuals. Melissa promised to use her legal team, her newsroom's subpoena powers, its appetite for litigation if necessary. She would handle the public shaping. He would bring the people who had been disappeared into oral history. Between Jean's network and Melissa's newsroom, threads began to pull. A security guard who had once worked at a warehouse called in a tip. There were people there who lived like employees but never left on weekends. A delivery manifest seemed wrong. A ledger entry contradicted a payroll stub. A former supervisor, nursing a guilty conscience and a new identity in a small town, sent a photo of a lock-in room. Stacked pallets, a pallet jack, beds arranged like cots in long rows. The photo was grainy and old, but it was enough to make a pattern if you had the will to see it. Shayla answered messages at odd hours, a trembling hand on her phone as she tried to reconcile pain with information. Jean paced outside an unremarkable building. Phantom pressed at his calves while he awaited a call. The city's arteries were full of rumors now, and the Wang's estate had the buzz of a hive, alarmed. Alexander's father, Victor, was a different kind of animal. Victor didn't make jokes in the cafe. He made quiet decisions in filtered light. His public face was philanthropy and urban renewal. His private face read like a ledger, factories, contracts, shipments, and a human resources department that specialized in smoothing the unseemly into acceptable loss. To the world, Victor was a benefactor with a foundation named after his deceased wife. To the people on the margin, he was the origin point where lives were parceled into commodities for the sake of efficiency. When Melissa's editors started to see the outlines of a pattern, they reached out with these sort of formal, polite letters that pretend to be gentle and are not. They asked Victor Wang for comment. They sent a request for internal audits and for employee records. The first reply they received was a bland statement of compliance, the kind of corporate letter that smelled of lawyers and carefully worded empathy. The second reply came in the form of denials and threats thinly veiled as offers of assistance. The Wangs had money to deploy in the fight for a clean reputation. They had PR consultants who were experts in lowering a story's temperature. Jean watched that exchange with a terrible knowledge of how quickly pressure could detonate. He also watched it with the understanding that the city's legal apparatus could be made to function if pressure was mechanized at scale. Documents leaked at the right moment, witnesses arranged to speak in the proper forum. He trusted Melissa to release the story in a manner that would have the most impact. He trusted his network to protect witnesses until their voices carried. Not everybody moved at the tempo Jean did. People like Shayla had rent, had daughters, had parents whose medicine could not wait for the slow machine of justice. There were deals to be made with the present while the future was being planned. Jean saw those trade-offs in the tired set of Shayla's shoulders and the hollow in her voice. He had to keep her safe and let the truth grow heavy enough to be real. In the first week after the coffee incident, small signs bloomed like bruises. A maintenance man turned up at a shuttered warehouse and found a room hastily emptied. Dust in the air and traces of bedding moved in a hurry. A driver admitted to a woman with a newsroom badge and trembling hands that he had seen numbers that didn't make sense on payrolls labeled as contract labor that arrived without contracts. A former supervisor in a small town called an editor from a payphone and promised to tell everything if he could do it on a recorder that would protect his identity. The more they pulled at the threads, the more the city seemed to cough up names. Names met with names, shipments matched times. And the ledger of the Wang's empire began to display the smudges that told a different story from the public gallery photos. Melissa's draft started to grow teeth. At night, Jean sat in his small apartment that smelled faintly of old books and Phantom's dog shampoo. He sent messages across encrypted apps he didn't want to name because naming it would sound like an instruction. He made phone calls. He attended prayer-like vigils at the edge of demonstrations without announcing his presence. Sometimes, people wrote to him anonymously, small notes included with the donated meals and the flowers left at memorial corners. He answered with the same steady care he offered Shayla, practical, patient. Shayla became more than a name in a headline to him. She became the axis of a human story that made numbers mean something. She spoke about Kesha in bursts, small, luminous sentences that made her sister present in a room full of absent people. She used to dance in our living room, Shayla said one night as the city's cold came through the apartment window. She would make up names for all the stray cats and keep diaries she never let anyone read. It's not just about finding Kesha, Jean said. He meant it. It's about ensuring no one else is hidden. Shayla nodded. If you find her and all the others, then this has meaning. Otherwise, it's a story, and we go back to our shifts. Jean had never been naive enough to think the press alone would break the system. It would take more than headlines and outrage. It would take testimonies, legal teeth, a pattern so undeniable that even the city's lovers of money couldn't swallow it. He also knew something else. The Wangs would not yield quietly. They had money and pride and armies in their own way. He imagined a man like Victor sitting at a long table, moving pieces with the calm of someone used to bending things to suit. Sometimes people need me to make them uncomfortable enough that they do the right thing, Jean told Shayla, who listened as if each word might be a brick in a structure she hadn't yet dared to build. When the newsroom called to confirm a time to publish, Melissa's voice on the line was a measured metronome. We can run this next Thursday, she said. We have corroboration on 3 warehouses. We have payroll discrepancies, travel logs, statements from 2 former employees, and a security tape that is telling. If we run it, it will make Victor Wang a target. It will also make anyone connected to him sweat. Are you ready for that? Shayla came to the newsroom for the meeting. She sat across from a table of people who smelled faintly of coffee and litigation, and watched the maps and photographs that Melissa had assembled. There were pictures of crates, of bare beds, of the angles of doors that made rooms look like cages in a daylight economy. There were timelines and receipts. The evidence assembled looked like a mirror made of small truths. "I'm ready," Shayla said. Her voice did not waver. "Be mindful," Melissa said. "We will protect what we can. We have lawyers on retainer for the witnesses. We have safe houses in place. We will not publish anything that risks someone's life." Jean watched them arrange themselves like pieces on a board. He felt the weight of every life that could change with a printed page. He thought about the possibility of retribution. He understood that exposure could be a kind of violence if not handled with care. It could make people targets. He also understood that secrecy was a worse violence, a slow erasure of lives. For days, the city pulsed beneath them as rumors hardened into plans. The Wong's PR began to spin, offering interviews and statements and carefully staged charity events. Someone suggested a philanthropic program for displaced workers. Someone else offered a scholarship in a neighborhood where the company had a long relationship. It was the same old script, the making of amends before any damage had been accounted for. The night before the scheduled expo, someone set a small fire at one of the city's legal aid centers that had been critical of labor exploitation. No one died, but the message was clear. Pressure creates ripples. Jean received the news with a flatness that betrayed a deeper worry. He had protected space for witnesses, but he had not built an armor that could stop a burner phone or a smoke signal. He realized, at once and with a practiced clarity, that documenting abuse was only the first step. Holding power accountable meant anticipating how power would strike back. He sent word to Arturo and to a woman coding data for Melissa's story people who could be relied upon when the world got loud. They moved documents, not people. Files were duplicated, encrypted, dispersed across platforms. The work looked like cautious bustle, the kind of preparation that feels like praying with your hands. At dawn, Shayla left a voice message to Kesha she had rehearsed a dozen times, a patchwork promise of safety, of how to find help, of where to go if she could. She whispered about the coffee incident like a map small, referential so someone else might understand the shape of what was happening. She left it because she could not bear the silence. That afternoon, Melissa's article went live. The headline was surgical. It did not scream. It named the facts. It laid out the documents with the grim humility of evidence. The story detailed allegations of forced labor, of employees who had no free time, of mysterious night shifts and payroll anomalies, of a corporate culture that favored productivity over people. It contained a slowly compiled mosaic of testimonies, photos, and ledgers tied to the Wong family's holdings. The city's reaction was immediate and volcanic. Social media churned. Protest groups that had only ever simmered found a roar. Legal offices that had thrived in the quiet of boardrooms found themselves besieged with calls. The stock market responded with the quick twitch of traders marshalling for damage control. The Wongs issued their bland denials. Victor scheduled appearances at hospitals and community centers, announcing donations that, in any other time, would have been lauded. Jean watched the storm from a distance he had designed. He had never wanted publicity-only results. He watched as pushback took form. Threats in anonymous messages, attempts to discredit witnesses with older records dredged up and spun into character attacks. The company tried to buy time by promising independent audits and offering support for affected communities. It was the same rehearsed dance. It was always the same tempo. Then the first retaliation came privately. An arsonist lit a small blaze at one of the safe houses. Smoke detectors screamed in the middle of the night, and a family of 3 clambered out into the alley with towels draped over their heads. No one was hurt, but the message was clear and personal. The Wongs had money and access. They had resources that could project force without exposing Victor's hands. Shayla answered a call at 2 a.m. from a voice that had been algorithmically cold. The person wanted to know why she had come forward, why she had told anyone, why she had made trouble. The call hung like a threat in the small apartment. Shayla put the phone down and began to pack a bag with the efficiency of someone who has had to leave in a hurry before. She did not want to leave her life behind, but she had an instinctive sense that staying was a luxury she could not afford. Genesio Ristorinto always measured, cracked at the edges. He had told himself he would not play the edges of the law, that he would stay on the side where evidence and pressure could be used like levers. But seeing a safe house burned, hearing threats delivered like winter wind, seeing Shayla forced to move again, these things eroded his patience. He did not want blood. He wanted the truth to be heavy enough to make the city see. The week stretched into a tangle of court filings, media appearances, and protests that turned into small, angry parades. There were hearings called ceremonia, performative, where corporate spokespeople sat side by side with lawyers and delivered statements of concern while deflecting responsibility. Victor Wang appeared at one event with a pressed face and an apologetic cadence, promising full cooperation, his smile practiced and public. Underneath the public spectacle, a quieter war brewed. People who had been held in shadow called in favors. A union organizer took a name to a lawyer willing to argue for subpoena. A former warehouse manager who had been moved to another city sent a video confession to Melissa's inbox. It was a mosaic of small braveries, each one a match lit in a long tunnel. Jean found himself pulled deeper into the machinery of accountability. He coordinated witness movement with the slow, meticulous patience of someone who understood that a false step could cost more than a headline. He did not tell people to do the impossible. He told them how to live between the possible and the necessary. He protected them not by giving orders but by giving them options. Shayla's recovery moved in fits and starts. Her burns healed into lines that would always carry the memory of that laugh. She attended hearings when she could, her testimony a thread in a web of other voices. She began, belatedly, to understand that the assault that had made the headline was not the worst of it. The structure that allowed that assault to happen without consequence was the more dangerous injury. Her sister's name sat on the tip of her tongue like a prayer. At night, Jean walked the city with Phantom, sometimes without purpose and sometimes with it. He felt the weight of a man used to making choices in the dark. People he had helped in the past stopped him on the street to offer small gestures, a bag of groceries, an offer to babysit, a whispered thank you that carried more currency than the Wang's donations. Gratitude, he had learned, was a powerful currency. When a reluctant whistleblower sent an address pointing to a building on the edge of the industrial district that had, until recently, been a shell company's front, Jean felt a readiness that bordered on hunger. He knew the number of people whose lives hinged on what came next. He also knew that a mistake now would be more than costly, it would be tragic. But he also knew they could not act alone. They needed an anchor in the public consciousness that would not let a judge or a boardroom sweep the allegations off the table with a donation and a press release. Melissa's peace had opened the city. Now they had to keep it open. As Jean stepped into the night and the city's neon bled into the rain, he felt the old, familiar calculus settle. There were stakes that could not be negotiated away. People who had been rendered invisible for years needed to be made visible. The methods to do it might make other people uncomfortable. He did not seek comfort. Phantom padded beside him, an even shadow on wet pavement. The dog's breath steamed in the cold. Jean thought about the price people paid for asking for justice and about whether he was willing to see that price paid by others or to shoulder it himself. He had vowed to be a conduit, not a mirror. The only thing he had left to decide was how loud to make the truth when the time came. If you want to follow how this escalates, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. They organized in rooms that smelled of coffee and old paper, where Melissa's newsroom hummed with printers and low voices. They marked dates on calendars and mapped routes in the abstract. A small team assembled. Arturo, with his battered notepads, a lawyer who had taken cases pro bono, a former HR clerk willing to testify anonymously, and Shayla, who had the stubbornness of someone who had known loss and decided to make a ledger of it. The documents began to stack: payroll anomalies, shipping manifests with missing receiver signatures, emails that hinted at instructions to limit door openings during certain shifts, nothing that spelled out forced labor in a single sentence, but together they began to form a lattice of implication. Melissa cross-checked everything. She found that a string of shell companies linked back in ways neither simple nor overt, to the Wang holdings. Each document was a small piece of a larger puzzle, and the larger puzzle suggested a system designed to Meanwhile, whispers of reprisals got louder. One of the journalists assigned to the story found a rock thrown through the driver's window of her car. A call came to Shayla late at night from an unknown number that remained silent for the duration of the call. The city's arteries had become nervous, as if some animal in the basement of power was moving. Jean did not relish conflict. He planned with the resolute focus of someone who had to keep people alive. When a source with direct knowledge of a specific warehouse said they could lead a team to a place where people had been seen, Jean pushed for caution and for preparation. Safe houses secured, legal counsel on standby, emergency numbers distributed. He refused to outline tactics or methods. He would not instruct people in things that could be used to harm, but he insisted that witnesses be protected and evidence be gathered carefully. At the same time, something else shifted. Alexander slipped. He stopped laughing publicly. He began to appear in the company of lawyers and to avoid the cafes where he performed his cruelties for likes. The ease of his entitlement was showing cracks. Victor, always the man who could soften a scandal with a check and a speech, displayed an irritation that looked like movement. Money could buy many things, but it could not always buy repentance. Late one night, as rain stitched the city with small, bright spiderwebs of light on wet streets, Jean received a call that would change the tone of his quiet strategy. A woman's voice, ragged and halting, told him she had seen someone being kept in a place with no windows. And she had a name. She was certain linked back to one of the Wang subsidiaries. She would only speak if a witness could come with her to corroborate and if there was a guarantee of safety. It was the kind of call that forced choices. Jean felt the old calculations take shape. Protect the women, make sure the journalists could verify, keep the legal leverage intact. He set the pieces on the board and called in favors. Nothing was yet decided, but the city had moved from chatter to design. They had, in the span of a week, turned a single, cruel act, coffee thrown in a cafe, into a lens capable of revealing a much larger rot. The narrative had sharpened. What began as a viral outrage had become an investigation into an empire's underbelly. The stakes scaled quickly, an ascension that was thrilling and terrible. As the night deepened, Melissa leaned over her keyboard and typed another paragraph that would push the story toward the public center. Shayla slept fitfully. Phantom curled at the foot of her cot in a safe house that smelled faintly of bleach and oranges. Jean sat on a stoop and watched the city, his hands tucked into his jacket, his mind a machine of contingencies. Somewhere, Alexander would be calculating his own options. Somewhere else, Victor would be talking to advisors about reputation and securities. In the quiet between news cycles, a new noise began to assert itself. The low, prepared hum of people about to be called out of shadow and into demand for accountability. Jean felt the hum like a storm gathering. He'd seen these kinds of storms before, and he had learned that you could not control the weather, you could only prepare the people beneath it. The morning after Melissa's article hit the internet, a lawyer for the Wangs issued a statement that was careful and thin. The company welcomed an inquiry and would cooperate fully. The markets dipped. The foundation changed the wording of its announcements. A small news channel begged for an interview with Alexander, who offered a practiced apology that slipped across his face like someone learning a new expression. But behind the statement and the practiced regret, the less visible part of the machine was moving. Security audits were ordered. Warehouses were locked down. People with knowledge went quiet. A hand reached for a witness, and a voice asked for silence. The world stuttered as money negotiated its way through the aftermath. Jean, who had never been comfortable with the idea of wealth as a shield, felt something dangerous in the air. He also felt a certainty that also had volatility. The more the Wangs tried to clean the story with donations and staged remorse, the more the public would dig. People who had been invisible for years were deciding to speak. People who had thought that their lives were a ledger entry were choosing to be accounts. He thought of Kesha, of her laughter in a living room that smelled of reheated dinners and detergent. He thought of every person whose work had been rendered invisible by ledger lines and corporate press releases. He made a small decision then, the kind that always looks like a move but feels like a promise. They would not allow money to buy time. They would not let apology be currency without consequence. At noon, Shayla stepped out of the safe house for the first time in days and felt the sun like an accusation. The city seemed to hold its breath with her. She had been pushed into the strange liminal space between being a victim and being a witness, and the balancing act felt precarious. She had, over the last week, learned to keep a list of people who owed her nothing and had, nevertheless, given her the courage to speak. Jean, Melissa, Archer, the nameless woman who had called and offered a crumb of direction. She turned the corner and found herself face to face with a placard propped against a fence where protesters had gathered. The headline from Melissa's story enlarged and pasted like a sign of excommunication. Faces leaned in, nodding as if the page held the shape of an ugly truth they had been waiting to confirm. For Shayla, it felt like a beginning, but for Jean, it felt like a threshold. He sensed the tightness around the Wongs contracting, ready to cut, like a fist closing. The pieces were in motion, and now the question was whether the law, the press, and the city's hunger for truth would be enough to keep people safe as those pieces moved. He stepped into the stream, not to lead a charge, but to make sure the people at the end of the line had a place to stand. His methods would be tested. Other people's lives hung on the outcome. He did not relish the violence that sometimes came with this work. He only accepted the burden of consequence rather than the satisfaction of spectacle. What followed was not a movie. It was a mediation between urgency and care. The city kept turning, indifferent to the tally of hurt. But inside rooms that smelled of printer ink and instant coffee, people were arguing over how to turn outrage into safety. 2 nights later, the reprisal arrived with a small, personal brutality. Shayla was doing what she always did, catching a late shift at a diner that paid in tips and overtime, when a man she had never seen before sat at the counter and asked too many questions about the Wang story. He left a note folded under a salt shaker that read nothing at first but contained a phone number in the margin. The same night, someone tripped a lock on the back of the safe house where she slept intermittently. Nothing dramatic, no explosions, no cinematic pursuit, just a clean, targeted message left in the places people used to feel private. A week after that, Shayla came home to find her apartment ransacked. Drawers were emptied, photographs torn and left in a pile on the floor. The small black notebook where she kept names and numbers gone. She called Jean before she called the police. The voice on the phone was steady in a way that the city rarely affords. "We'll move you," he said. Now. They moved her to a hospital for observation. After a paramedic arriving, the next morning found her collapsed on a sidewalk with a fractured cheekbone and a concussion. The injuries were blunt and indiscriminate, mostly consequences of a beating meant to intimidate rather than to kill. The attackers had learned restraint. They had not learned empathy. Shayla awoke days later to the antiseptic light of intensive care, a silence that felt like a void and the weight of being watched. When she tried to speak, words scrambled like loose beads. The nurse told her she had been kept alive by quick responders. The doctor explained things with a clinical thriftiness that could not be made to sound like morality. Jean sat in the chair by her bed, eyes raw, hands folded, Phantom's black head resting between his feet, as if the dog, too, understood the need for vigil. "It's okay to be angry," Jean told her. The first time she tried to ask who had done it. "But being hurt doesn't mean you stop being smart." "I want them to see what they did," Shayla said. Her voice was thin as a sheet. "I want them to pay for what they took." Jean looked at her long enough that she could see the calculus in his face. The part she had watched before, in the corner of the cafe, the part that wanted results and the part that counted the cost of getting them. "We will make them answer," he said. "But answering can't just be payment, it has to be accountability." In the days that followed, Melissa's newsroom did the work it had promised. They published a follow-up piece that named shell companies and mapped their connections to an elaborate corporate web owned by the Wang Holdings. The article included testimony from workers who had slipped out of warehouses in the middle of the night and from payroll clerks who had quietly annotated ledgers in a language of erasure. It included, too, the grainy footage of rooms stacked with cots, the silence of people who had not learned the sound of their own names. The city reacted with protests, with calls to action, with lawyers calculating like architects how to sever a foundation's supports without bringing down the whole building. For weeks, the Wongs issued statements, softened appeals, and anemic denials. Money slid into community boards like lubricant, meant to quiet the creak of truth. But something else had shifted. The story had acquired faces, and faces do not silence easily. Then came the ledger that could not be purchased. A courier in the newsroom found an envelope tucked behind a radiator in a public library. Inside were names handwritten and trembling of people who had been taken into rooms with no windows. The names had addresses that matched odd, rented storefronts. A photograph showed the corner of a shipment receipt with a partially legible stamp. Nothing in that envelope read like a smoking gun, but together with everything else it assembled into a pressure that began to force doors. Jean pushed the team to focus on the people in those rooms. He had seen the way the Wongs used money as an eraser. He wanted story and testimony to be the abrasive that wouldn't let them rub it away. He moved quietly, making sure that every witness who came forward had access to medical attention, to legal counsel, and to a roof. He spent long nights cataloging names and cross-referencing them in a notebook so full of coffee rings it looked like an old diary. At the edge of this constriction, the Wongs' retaliation escalated. Someone followed an investigator home and slashed the tires on their car. A brick was thrown through Melissa's assistant's apartment window. Threats began to move from anonymous to personal. Video messages watched by 1,000 partial eyes that contained only a single frame of a town name. A license plate, the rear of a truck, disappearing into an industrial lot. Intimidation was meticulous and corporate. It had the calm of people who had practiced exerting force without leaving fingerprints. The attack on Shayla was the turning point in the way that allows the moral center of a story to swing. She lingered in the hospital, the doctors cautious about her spine, the neurology team reluctant to promise full restitution of the small things: taste, sleep, the way sunlight used to mean nothing but welcome. She could not speak for long stretches. When she could, her sentences were short and sharp, with purpose. "I don't want them to win because they hurt me," she said once. Her hand curled around a paper cup. "I want them to lose because they thought they could make people invisible." Jean listened. "Then we do the thing that keeps people alive and gives them a voice," he said. "We make the truth impossible to buy." What happened next was less a secret plan than a crescendo of pressure from two directions. Evidence in the public square and human testimony that could not be ignored. Melissa worked at a pace that made for legal headaches and moral necessity in equal measure. She had secured testimony from a crew of former employees who had fled to different states. She had, too, verified through payroll subpoenas and court-approved channels the trail of invoices and transfers that tied Shell companies back to Wang Holdings. Those documents did something other than embarrass the Wongs. They opened a trail mounted on policy and accounting anomalies. When federal investigators, compelled by public attention and mounting complaints, began knocking on the doors of firms tied to Victor Wong's empire, the empire shook. Offices that had been bastions of carefully curated philanthropy found auditors rifling through files. They found payroll entries labeled as temporary contract labor that never aligned with any legitimate contracts. They found housing arrangements that looked, in practice, like confinement with work. Victor Wong, who had learned to speak in smooth intervals, began to look ragged in the face. He took a private jet to meet with lawyers, and the jet looked for a week like a fortress in motion. When investigators executed legal orders, warrants that pried open locked files, the company unleashed its best reputational defenses: third-party auditors, new ethics committees, a glossy campaign promising worker welfare. The public, however, had tasted a version of the truth that staring money in the face could not wash away. As pressure mounted, so did violence. In one chilling night, the small warehouse, where a few witnesses had been staying, was set alight from the outside. Quick responders put the flames out, but the fire had been enough to scorch furniture, to burn a set of legal documents kept for safety, and to leave 13 people without their belongings. The message was not subtle. The Wongs could hurt the infrastructure of testimony. Shayla's condition worsened after that. A man arrived at the hospital with a simple request: to speak to her. He was allowed in, under the assumption he was family. He was not. Surveillance footage showed a delivery van, a curated act of proximity, a language of access, purchased with the right envelopes. He sat near Shayla, leaned over her and tapped her face with something small and drugged. In the days that followed, he would be described in court filings as a companion. Shayla never recovered fully from the resulting infection that swept into a weak point in her body. She fell into a coma that lasted weeks, a silence that felt like another kind of erasure. When Shayla lay still, and the hospital corridor hummed with the indifferent machines that keep time for life, Gene's patience was consumed by a sharpened something that looked like resolve. He did not seek revenge. He sought a different, harsher currency, accountability that could not be sloughed off with a check. That resolve had to be balanced with a desperate care, for the living Shayla's life hung in the balance. But so did the lives of dozens who remained hidden. He and Melissa pressed forward. They coordinated with lawyers and with activists who could provide shelter and anonymity. They arranged medical care for those who came forward and psychiatric support for the terrified. Melissa's next series of pieces did not fling accusations into the void. It built a timeline of transactions and movements that was difficult to dismiss. It included a ledger that matched cargo manifests with records of labor shifts and bank transfers that led to subsidiaries no one had suspected. Then something else happened that changed the story's tone in an almost theatrical way. Alexander, the man who had started a viral moment with a laugh, began to falter publicly. He stopped appearing in certain circles. His social feeds quieted, and his friends stopped posting the sorts of images that lubricated privilege. Rumors surfaced that someone had offered him an ultimatum: money, exile, or public testimony. The rumors were messy and contradictory, as rumors tend to be, but they signaled a hand moving pieces behind screens. What happened to Alexander was not a neat, cinematic abduction with hurtful instruction manuals. It was a removal from his life of comfort, an extraction from the garden of privilege into the harsher light of truth. People associated with Gene's network, former soldiers who knew how to move unseen, advocates who knew how to isolate a person safely, a few insiders tired of the ledger's cost, was what the papers later suggested, though they could not all agree on the specifics. The mythology around the event would grow. But the core of it was simple. Alexander woke up somewhere other than a penthouse, with little of the soundtrack of his life, and with a small set of things arrayed on a table in front of him like evidence in a courtroom. On that table were items he could not deny. Photographs of faces, a blurred but recognizable snapshot of a woman sleeping on a cot in a warehouse, a recording of a woman reading the names of people who had disappeared, a USB drive that played surveillance footage showing the scales of the operation. There was a stack of documents that bore signatures connecting shell companies to Wang Holdings. And there was, perhaps most importantly, the faces of people who had been hurt, Shayla's name among them. He was offered a choice that was both moral and mercantile. Continue to live in the world that had taught him to think of people as expendable, or unmoor himself from that future by telling the unvarnished truth in a court of law. He could give testimony that would bring down a machine he'd been raised to defend, or he could take money, leave the city, and let the ledger be closed again. Alexander's moment of choice was not instantaneous. He stayed in that room for days, watched at first with the uncaring malice that had made him popular in certain circles. Then he watched evidence with a stranger's focus, as if the footage were another kind of mirror he had avoided for years. At one point, a woman whose face he had only ever seen in the margins of a viral video, one of the warehouse survivors, to him directly, through a screen. She read her child's name aloud and described what the family had lost when a parent was taken. What broke him was not violence. It was recognition. He saw with a clarity that wealth had obscured, that the ledger he had lived with was written in human bodies. The easier options: flight denial, settlement deferred, temporary relief, testimony, humiliation, legal exposure, and the prospect of losing everything opened a path to something rarer. A dismantling of systems that allowed the exploit. Whether he felt guilt or fear or both was less important than the decision itself. He opted to testify. When Alexander walked into a courtroom, not as a swaggering heir, but as a witness, the city watched and judged. His testimony did not read like a confession born of conscience. It read like a man setting down the story he had been allowed to keep only at the price of other people's lives. He named people, signed off on accounts, and handed over details that made lawyers in the room lean forward with the hunger of professionals finally given material to work with. Victor Wong did not go quietly. The Patriarch's arrest when it came was procedural and precise. Federal agents in suits with warrants that had teeth. News anchors framed the moment as a collapse, and it felt like one in the public imagination. Victor's lawyers insisted on due process. Most of the city insisted on accountability. The public spectacle was immense and necessary, and terribly incomplete. The indictments that followed were broad. Corporate officers were named in counts that included conspiracy, forced labor, and human trafficking statutes where the factual matrix fit. The city had not seen such a concentrated moment of corporate fallibility in years. For the people who had been held in rooms behind locked doors, for the families who had been told their loved ones had left voluntarily, this was a justice long delayed. Shayla's slow climb out of coma coincided with the slow legal movements. When she finally opened her eyes and recognized Jean and Phantom, the room seemed to breathe with her. Recovery would be long, and uneven there would be scars. Both seen and unseen, but she was alive. With time and therapy, Shayla learned to put words together again and to take on the tasks that she had once thought impossible. Meeting with lawyers, testifying in a way that was careful about re-traumatization, and speaking to cameras when she could handle the glare. Kesha reappeared in a way that felt like a miracle engineered by persistence. She was found after a woman who had once worked in a recruitment office for a subcontractor recognized her photograph and went to the only place she could think of, an advocacy group connected to Melissa. She had been moved between sites and given a false identity by a supervisor who made small bureaucratic decisions that added up to erasure. The moment of her rescue was not cinematic. It was a sequence of phone calls, whispered assurances, and cautious coordination that ended with a woman finally being able to name her sister's face and hold it for real again. The survivor's return to the public was careful and intentional. Jean arranged for long-term care options, for counseling, for job training that didn't look like charity but like restoration. Melissa's work had opened doors, but had also required careful hand-holding afterward. Journalists do not always think through the long tail of trauma their stories release. Jean, who had always been more comfortable in the dark, began to take on a public role as a facilitator of safety. Sometimes invisible, sometimes present at hearings, always careful to maintain the boundary between advocacy and coercion. When courtrooms convened, witnesses described their lives in a way that made the ledger of the Wang Empire tangible. They told a story in small, vital details. The knock at the door. The room with no windows. The way a supervisor's face said what an order could not. They did not produce photos of torture or graphic scenes. Instead, they spoke of hours, of names, of the slow theft of time that defines many modern forms of exploitation. Victor Wong was indicted. The trials that followed were messy and public, and, in many ways, anticlimactic. Justice rarely is a cathartic crescendo. There were pleas and strategic settlements and guilty pleas from lower-level executives who chose to trade truth for a lesser sentence. Some executives went to trial. Some were convicted. The city's institutions, spurred by shame and by the exposure, were forced to institute changes, audits, independent oversight, and worker safeguards, the scope of which would be debated for years. But the most important, lasting consequence was not legal alone. On the grounds of one of the decommissioned warehouses formerly a place of confinement, the Survivors Foundation was born. Shayla, shaky on her feet but steady in her resolve, became one of its founding directors. Kesha, who had reared her head above the bottom of her life and been met with care, joined the board and insisted the foundation be it would offer job training, legal aid, counseling, and an industry watchdog that could respond to suspicious labor practices with a speed the courts sometimes lacked. The foundation did more than give services. It reclaimed space. What had once been a dark, unnamed factory was cleared, repainted, and converted into a series of studios, classrooms, and communal kitchens. Survivors were employed to renovate and staffed the place. The first cafe on the new property hired formerly exploited workers and paid a living wage. It was a small thing in the ledger of corporate damage, but a huge thing in human terms. A place where people could earn money without fear. Public opinion on Gene hardened in parts of the city. Some called him a necessary villain. Others called him a criminal. He did not court either title. He continued to operate in the margin between legality and necessity. He kept a lower profile, but he did not disappear. The narrative that had grown around Hume of a protector who sometimes bent rules proved both useful and dangerous. He remained a figure of debate, but for the survivors who benefited from his intervention and the networks he had assembled. He was a man who had kept promises. Alexander's choice to testify had repercussions beyond legal outcomes. He agreed to sign away parts of his inheritance into a fund for survivors and to provide testimony against corporate actors who had been complicit in exploiting people. The symbolic value of that decision was enormous. The practical consequences were messy and contested in courtrooms and financial departments for months. Some saw his decision as others saw it as the first step toward accountability. Shayla, when asked, said she didn't want to say his name. Without context, he had helped make truth possible, but she would not reduce her life to a single act of mercy or a single testimony. The Wang family brand was wounded, but not entirely erased. The towers that had once been symbols of civic pride now stood with a few windows darkened by the stain of scandal. Victor faced criminal charges and, eventually, conviction for corporate malfeasance that included trafficking charges where the evidence met legal thresholds. The company restructured settlements were reached with several plaintiffs, and new oversight mechanisms were instituted, but the deeper work of cultural change would be a long, contested process. In the Foundation's early meetings, Shayla sat at a table with a stack of notebooks and a soft, practical determination. She insisted that the organization avoid the common trap of becoming a PR veneer. "We can't be another poster," she said. "We have to be a place that does the labor that money won't do on its own." She worked long hours. She met with survivors who had stories that ranged from the quietly tragic to the bureaucratically cruel. She oversaw a microloan program that provided entrepreneurs with small capital and mentorship. She insisted the cafe offer counseling on paydays, practical psychological care offered at the moment money changed hands. She fought with fundraising boards and negotiated with city councils. She slept like somebody building something fragile and dear. Kesha, once the missing sister, whose name had been a ghost in conversations, became a public speaker in her own right. She talked about becoming invisible inside systems that treat workers as commodities, and about the way identity could be reconstructed with the right supports. Her testimony helped push through local ordinances that improved transparency in subcontracting and in the conditions of temporary labor. Melissa continued to write. Her reporting turned to watchdog pieces about the long tail of corporate responsibility. She wrote about how institutions often rebrand to avoid deeper fixes and about the ways in which philanthropy can both help and obscure. Her reporting did not stop systemic injustice. Nothing single-handedly does, but it pushed the conversation into public institutions and forced regulators to act in ways that had been unlikely before the story broke. Gene returned to the quiet parts of his life that he had always preferred. An apartment smelling of old books, a dog that refused to leave his knees. He watched the city from distant porches and sometimes stepped into public hearings as an anonymous witness or an unnamed advocate who had no face on the front page. He did not like to be thanked. Gratitude, he had often said, is a currency that should be shared. Sometimes, in the weeks and months after the trials, Gene found himself at the cafe where it all began. He would sit in a corner booth, this time watching not predators, but people. The cafe had a new staff policy and a poster that taught employees their rights. The patrons were different. Journalists and activists and neighbors who had learned the weight of the city's undercurrent. Phantom, older now but still watchful, slept in the doorway. Shayla returned to work much later, not as a server under a manager who changed after the scandal, but as a director of operations for the Foundation's cafe and training kitchen. Her hands bore the faintly white scars of healed burns, and sometimes she caught her reflection in a window and felt the thrum of survivor's guilt. She used it as fuel. She trained staff not only in food service, but in admin skills, in labor rights, in how to document workplace abuses. The cafe became an emblem. Food, dignity, and a paycheck that did not come at the cost of freedom. In small neighborhood meetings, Shayla spoke about Kesha and other women like her who had been hidden in the machinery of industry. People listened. They asked questions about how to spot exploitation and what to do when a friend was missing. The foundation provided a hotline, legal clinics, and a mobile medical unit that served those who were afraid to cross town lines and those who had just escaped a life of enforced labor. The city, slow, plural, resistant to quick fixes, kept moving. Some companies instituted long overdue reforms. Other companies rebranded and stayed dangerous, changing names and sailing into new markets. The ledger of exploitation is long and adaptive. The work of undoing it never truly ends. Gene never made himself a public hero. He continued to move at the edge of the law, and people argued over the ethics of that, but nobody could deny the practical outcomes. Witness protection when the state was slow, medical attention for those who had none, a small network of people who understood how to support survivors. His moral ambiguity remained a subject of conversation and of critique. He slept badly sometimes, and he saw faces in the dark. He had, in his life, used the tools at his disposal to prevent more people from disappearing into the ledger. The Survivors Foundation thrived in ways its founders had hoped and in ways none could have predicted. It became an incubator for policy ideas and a model for other cities battered by the same kinds of corporate negligence. Shayla and Kesha eventually opened a small legal clinic inside the renovated warehouse, offering counsel to low-income workers and a community hub where documentation could be safely made and stored. Years later, on the anniversary of the cafe incident, Shayla stood outside the foundation's kitchen and watched a line of people stream inside for the day's free lunch while others took baking classes. Children chased each other around a picnic table where an old pallet had been turned into a community garden. She had learned to read the city in new ways, not as a ledger of losses, but as a ledger being read. She thought of the moment Alexander had laughed when he filmed her burn. She had chosen, deliberately, not to let his image be the definition of her story. He had been a fulcrum for change, an ugly fulcrum, perhaps, but a fulcrum nonetheless. She had chosen repair over spectacle, a choice that demanded patience and a stubborn refusal to accept quick settlement in place of systemic redress. At a lunchtime event, a small plaque was unveiled on the corner of the property, engraved to honor survivors and to note that the space had been reclaimed from harm. It was modest, hand-lettered, and accompanied by the names of volunteers and a line about solidarity. Shayla read it aloud, her voice steady, and then looked out at the crowd whose lives, in various ways, had been rearranged by the events that surged out from a single caffeinated cruelty. Gene watched from the edge of the crowd, a silhouette known to many but fully identified by few. Phantom was with him, slower now, but still patient. Someone in the crowd, an old woman who had been a volunteer, caught his eye and mouthed thank you with a sincerity that had nothing to do with headlines. He only nodded. When people asked Shayla about Gene, she was careful. "He's complicated," she said once in an interview. "He did things I didn't always understand, but he helped gather our voices and protected people who might have been lost. I'm not going to make a saint out of anybody. I'm going to make sure the work keeps going." In the quieter months that followed, the foundation funded research into contracting transparency and supported legislation that required more public disclosure of subcontracting chains. It advocated for stronger protections for temporary workers and for new enforcement mechanisms where labor was outsourced. None of this was glamorous. It took time and painful coalition building with labor groups, sympathetic lawmakers, and industry insiders who had moral awakenings or who found it pragmatic to avoid public shaming. The old warehouses were slowly reconfigured into spaces that taught trades rather than enforced them. The city, stirred by the scandal, began to invest in labor inspection and in community outreach programs that supported people in precarious work. It was a small, slow revolution, neither perfect nor total. And Gene, he continued to watch. He lived a life that was half in shadow and half in the sunlight that filtered through court documents and public hearings. He acknowledged to himself, in rare and private moments, the cost of the choices he'd made. He had taken steps that would never be entirely defensible and had refused to bow when the city looked away. He had learned that sometimes legality and justice tangle in ways that leave everyone with difficult decisions. He did not speak about his regrets publicly. He kept them close as a kind of moral ballast. Phantom grew old and died in Jean's arms one winter. The dog had been a presence through the darkest parts of that long year. Jean buried him under a maple tree in a small park and left food for the squirrels for a week. There was no ceremony beyond the small grief he allowed himself, but even that felt like an admission that life had cost him things. The final public act in the saga of the Wangs was not a victory lap. It was a set of hearings in which multiple parties, some repentant and some forced to speak, gave accounts. Some paid fines, some lost titles. Victor's sentence was a headline for a day. The survivors' work and the Foundation's ongoing programs were quieter and longer-term measures of change. In the end, the city had been forced to reckon with the fact that a video of a ventottled man laughing as he hurt a woman had been a small window into a larger culture of exploitation. The viral clip had started the conversation, but it was the slow, careful work of witnesses, journalists, lawyers, and advocates that turned that conversation into consequence. On a clear afternoon, not long after, Shayla stood behind the counter of the Foundation's cafe. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the reclaimed space. A young woman approached the counter, eyes downcast and hesitant. Shayla recognized the mannerisms of someone who'd been taught to disappear. She gave the woman a menu, a warm smile, and a job application in the same movement. "You'll do fine here," Shayla said. "We look out for each other." The woman looked up, uncertain, then nodded. The exchange was small, mundane, and miraculous in its order. Jean watched from across the room as Shayla taught the woman how to steam milk without burning it. He saw Keisha hand a newcomer a box of donated uniforms and heard the laughter of children collecting juice boxers for a school drive. He felt the city's pulse shift in a way that mattered. It was not a full restoration. It was a beginning that was rooted in survivors' agency. He left the cafe without fanfare. Outside, the street hummed with life, a same city that had allowed exploitation now also sheltering the seedbeds of resistance. In the distance, the towers that bore the Wang name rose, an architectural memory of a different era. They would remain, as many old wrongs do, as monuments to what had once been permitted. But inside the community spaces that had been carved out of their shadow, life continued, stubborn and insistently human. There would always be debate about the ethics of the choices Jean and others had made, the bending of rules, the strategic discomfort that led to legal outcomes. Those debates were necessary, and Jean welcomed them in the quiet way of a man who knew his own limitations. He believed, fundamentally, that systems bend toward wholeness only when people insist. He also believed the margins required a different language of action, one that prioritized lives over neat legalism. He never expected unanimous praise. That had never been his measure. His measure was the names on lists and the people who could once again say them without fear. Shayla's last public line in the story, one she used at community events and in interviews, was as simple as it was resolute. "We will not be erased." When the camera pulled back on the Foundation's refurbished facade that had once been a place of confinement, it showed crowds and activity and the small, almost invisible repairs that constitute civic healing. A child planting basil in a repurposed shipping crate, a woman in a suit listening to a survivor's story, a group of volunteers teaching carpentry. The story that began with a laugh and a cup of boiling coffee had become a long, difficult arc toward restitution. It had been messy, morally complicated, and incomplete. It had also been real. If this story moved you, share it and subscribe for more deep dives into justice, power, and consequence. What would you do if you saw injustice and no one else moved?